Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to see so many people show up, given our 24/7 news cycle about the dread coronavirus, which is serious business. But first, I should thank my friend Jim Halloran for inviting me. I hope that you'll like what I'm going to say. If you don't like it, blame Jim. If you do like it, thank me. You know, the corona scare is, and not to diminish the seriousness of it, because I don't know if, like you, I'm very conscious. When I travel a lot. I tell my kids, when you travel, wash your hands, don't touch your face. I've been saying that to my kids for years. It's a running joke in the family that you know, Dad's always saying that, and their mother's always saying that, which is, it's the vector that infects you with flu virus. But I don't know about you. It's impossible not to. When you're traveling, what you discover is you're always touching your face. Makes you kind of crazy just thinking about it. So some pundit was on CNBC this morning and just said, I give up. I give up. I'm not even going to try to stop touching my face anymore. But the coronavirus and its effect on the world actually is telling us something about oil and gas, obviously, right? The metric that's being used to measure its when we reach the turning point in China, in fact, is measuring oil demand and electricity consumption in China, for obvious reasons. The inverse is exactly the same. You measure economic growth by virtue of energy demand. The fact that energy demand is linked to economic growth ought not to be necessary to say that it's a lockstep relationship, but in our modern times, it's essential to remind people. In fact, Bill Gates has said it over and over again in his public speeches. The new Microsoft carbon-free pledge, about which we can talk if you like, but if you read their actual pledge, which I did, I have a pathology when I read stuff. So when somebody publishes a report, I read it, usually, because I want to know what they actually said as opposed to what people say they said. If you read the carbon pledge from Microsoft, it's an extraordinarily good document. I commend it to you all to go to their website. It's easy to Google, the magic Google machine, Microsoft Carbon Pledge. You'll get to it. It's a long document, and it says a lot about what I'm going to say. But in it, there are two things that it says, and I'll give you the big reveal. One of them is that economic growth is inextricably tied to energy consumption. They just assert it, and then they explain why. And I'll show you some more, which the coronavirus, of course, is reminding us of. And the other thing that it ends with, buried after pages and pages of scrolling through, is something which is the focal point of my remarks, is that, and Bill Gates has said this, but so I see Bill Gates' fingerprints in the carbon pledge from Microsoft, unsurprisingly, since I think he's still executive chairman. It says that the technologies we need to change the energy economy, and this is a direct quote, don't exist. This is from Microsoft. So as we recover from the current concerns about, and we will recover from this virus spread in due course, no one knows whether we're talking days, weeks, or months, but we'll recover, and energy demand will come back. We'll get back to normal. The real question that I'm going to try to illuminate for you is the normal on the other side of this a new normal, a new energy economy? Are we on the cusp of some massive energy transition, which is the new phrase, right? The energy transition is the phrase du jour, now being used instead of Green New Deal or new energy economy. Every pundit, every organization, every policymaker is talking about the transition, and by that they mean a transition from hydrocarbons, the stuff you do, to a post-hydrocarbon world. We're being told that that is inevitable. It's not that it's needed, and I'm not going to talk about climate change. That's the motivation for it. The motivation this time, last time we had to get off of hydrocarbons, it's because we were running out of them. This time we have to get off hydrocarbons because we have too much of them. Detail. I opposed the premise then, in the book, the bottom as well, and in testimony, and I oppose the premise now. I mean, but that doesn't matter. The real question is not whether or not we need to get something other than hydrocarbons. This is the interesting and most important question I want to illuminate. Is there a replacement? Can we? Is there a transition? And setting all the rhetoric aside, so I'm a numbers guy, and I apologize. At lunch, you really don't want to do numbers and graphs, but we're going to do numbers and graphs because, well, I'm a numbers guy, and the facts kind of matter. So here's the one graph that you need, and the only graph that you need to answer the question, is there an energy transition imminent that's happening at an accelerating pace? So you know the phrase, another favorite catchphrase is we have a disruptive set of technologies underway, favorite word in Silicon Valley, that has an inevitable transition at an accelerating pace. All right? This is the world's energy consumption as a percent supplied by renewables from 1800 forecast through 2050. So it's the share of all world energy supplied by renewables. It's not surprising for you to know that most of the world's energy was renewables for most of history. The reason it's not 100% on this graph, you probably know this, but just so you know that the graph is not a silly graph, is that the percent that's not renewables, wood and burning dung and stuff like that, is it's labor, slave labor, humans. So some of the power that supplies energy to the world has always been muscle power. Some of it's animals, but a lot of it was human muscle power in history. So what you can see is a very long run trend, which you all know what that came from. This discovery first of coal, then oil and gas, drove the share of world energy down from 80+% being renewables to about 12%. It's been at the 12% level, give or take, for the last couple decades or more, several decades. So now we're told we are under it's an incredibly profound acceleration of technology that's transitioning us to a renewable world. And we have the Paris Accord, which 198 nations, I think is the correct number, but it's give or take a couple, that have signed the Paris Accord. We know which nation didn't sign it, or did and then did not. Fair enough. You should know that the Paris Accord lays out a plan that countries are pledging to stop using hydrocarbons. It's essentially what the pledge is. This graph shows you what's actually happening and what would happen if everybody did what they promised. So first thing is, if you look at this, if you can look down to the bottom right, that little light blue line is the forecast. That's what's actually happening. That's what countries are doing now to implement non-hydrocarbon energy policies in their nations. And the collective impact will increase the world's share of energy from renewables from 12% to around 15% by 2040. So that's, 3 percentage points of a global economy is not nothing. It's a big number. Not exactly a revolution, but it's not nothing. If everybody did what they pledged, you get the pink line. You get all the way up to 19% of the world's energy come from renewables if everybody does what they promised they would do in the Paris Accord. So here's the truth of the matter, and the IEA has said this, so it's not me saying it. Every nation except 2 have withdrawn from the Paris Accord by their actions. 2 countries are doing what they promised in the Paris Accord, right? Gambia and Morocco. Probably not going to move the meter. What everybody else is doing is a light blue line. That's what they're actually doing, or what they say they're going to do. And I'm choosing those words for a purposeful reason. That's what they say they'll do, because many of these promises over the next 20 years are anchored in very big subsidies and assumptions and pledges that have been made by governments all over the world, that we are going to build X. And what the IEA says, even if you build what you say you're going to build, you get the light blue line. You don't even get the pink line. This is not a transition. This is not a revolution. It's meaningful. I'll restate it again. If the world's economies increase the consumption of energy from wind, solar, and batteries, which is, let's stipulate, when people say renewables, when people say new energy, they don't mean the old phrase, a multitude of choices. They mean 3 things: wind, solar, and batteries. They don't mean multitude of anything. They mean those 3 things. Everything is about wind, solar, and batteries now. It's a monomaniacal obsession with wind, solar, and batteries to replace everything else. And to then say, well, it's important, let's accelerate this by putting more money behind it and more incentives. There's two questions on the acceleration. Could you accelerate it with money? And is an acceleration inevitable because technology is changing so fast? So I'll talk about the technology part primarily, but let me just illuminate the money part. Assume for the sake of argument that money could accelerate it. What you really are talking about with accelerating this is changing what you build, not changing so much how much you build. Do you understand what? Renewable energy is not renewable. You all know this, right? All energy is, let's just begin with a science fact. My apologies for being a physicist. All energy is infinite in supply and all energy is free. We didn't create the energy in the universe, and it's just there. The sun is there, the oil is there, the gas is there. We didn't create it. It's free. What costs money is access to the land where it's usefully acquired and building hardware from stuff you dig out of the ground, and the hardware costs money and it wears out. All hardware wears out. It's one of the physics laws called entropy. Everything wears out. Nothing is renewable. Everything has to be built, replaced, and maintained. So renewable energy and hydrocarbons are identical in those senses. The only difference is what law of nature, if you like, you're choosing to tap that's free, for which we spend money in engineering and hardware to tap it, to make it into something useful. So all energy sources have the same characteristic. In the end, all that matters is the money. And the money is determined what the engineering allows you. So I'll give you one last calibration point. I'm spending the most time on this graph because, as I said at the outset, it tells you everything. It really does. The renewable energy industry globally today produces as much energy as the oil and gas industry globally produced in 1950. Just as a benchmark for starting, which is a lot of energy. In the 1950s, the world was a big economy. But here's the thing to think about in terms of hardware and building stuff and expanding an industrial ecosystem. Over the half century from 1950 to 2000, the global oil and gas industry increased tenfold. That's a big increase, tenfold increase. The renewable energy industry today is equal in size, remind you, to what oil and gas was in 1950. To have renewable energy replace global hydrocarbons, it would have to increase 90-fold from where it is today. 90, not tenfold, 90-fold. What people are saying is that's going to happen in 20 years. So they're saying that the industrial infrastructure of a mechanical and industrial physical system to supply energy for the world is now going to expand 90x in the next 20 years, when a comparable physical system took 50 years to grow 10x. It's not going to happen. This is not a forecast based on wishful thinking or me having a love for oil and gas over wind and solar. It's just, these are not feasible things. In physics, again, it's like inertia. Big systems are hard to move quickly. It's not that it could never happen. It's just never going to happen in a couple decades, and not at the scales that people are proposing. So then what normally happens is we devolve off the world to say, well, we should just focus on the United States. What if we just focused on the US, what we could do here? And what if we focus only on the electric grid, because the electric grid is where wind and solar are the most useful. We get our transition into the other markets with a Tesla, which I'll come to. But initially, we want to focus on the electric grid, just to give you a sense of scale again quickly. In order to replace use of hydrocarbons on the US electric grid in the next 20 years, which is, again, a serious proposal being made by people, not by AOC people, but by many serious people. And I don't mean to denigrate her. I think she's serious. I mean, I really do. I think she's serious about her beliefs. But this is just an arithmetical fact. If we were to replace the hydrocarbon share of the US electric grid, we'd have to build stuff, uncomplicated. How much stuff do you have to build? You can measure this in, and this is what this graph shows you. The y-axis is watts per person, watts per capita of construction of hardware on a grid. And it shows you the construction rate in the United States, China, and Germany, the three biggest grids in the world, over the last half century. And what you can see is at different times, the construction rate at which we added stuff to the grid varied, and there were peak times when China, the United States, and Germany added a lot of stuff to their grids. In order to replace hydrocarbons on our grid in the United States, we'd have to have a construction rate 14 times higher than the peak construction rate on any electric grid ever in the history of the world. That's essentially a World War II mobilization level. honest environmentalists who want that use that language. We need a World War II mobilization level. They're right. You would. And in fact, this is probably somewhat higher than a World War II mobilization level of construction. I don't think that'll happen. I mean, it's just we're not going to mount a World War II level of mobilization, nor can we afford it, to replace hydrocarbons on the U.S. grid. And if we did, let's just say whatever happens in November results in the Democrats running the table and passing a law and say we're going to do that. Could happen. I mean, it's not impossible. I'm not going to make any political aspersions or statements. Could happen. Governments can do stuff like that. Governments can do whatever they like. If it were to happen and we were successful in doing it, you can do the math on this. This is not a physics problem. It's an arithmetic problem. If the United States successfully replaced all the hydrocarbons on its electric grid, it would eliminate 6% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions for a World War II level of mobilization. This is not a meaningful moving the meter. And that 6% would be wiped out in about 3 years of growth in Asian energy demand, in particular from the 300 gigawatts of coal plants that China is contracted, not planning to, but contracted to build in the Asian economies, not in their own economy, but in other Asian economies. So let me sort of wind this down to the sort of very practical, specific comparison. All of this is, all this motivation to say that the new energy technologies can replace oil and gas has come from this statement that's repeated over and over again. We're now at grid parity. They now cost the same. And you read this constantly. Every time I read this, I'm scratching my head, reading the report, trying to figure out how do they get to that conclusion. And I can't get to the same conclusion except through elliptical arguments about life cycle cost and future costs brought forward. I used to work as an engineer. I'm a physicist. You do stuff in the back of the envelope. You start from basic principles. Here's a basic principle thing. If you can figure out how much energy you can get from spending $1, forget subsidies. Just would you spend $1 of capital, assume that's your money, how much energy do you get from spending that $1 on a piece of hardware over the life of the hardware? This is a very easy number to calculate. That's what this graph shows you. For $1 worth of a shale rig in the Marcellus, over 30 years, this counts the decline curve, how much energy does it produce? And here I'm measuring it, as you can see, sort of in watt hours, kilowatt hours, so we can have common denominators. And I can do the same thing for a solar array that I buy today, a utility grade, I don't mean rooftop, the cheapest possible solar array, and a wind turbine. And when you do the arithmetic, this is what you get, right? $1 spent on a shale rig in the Marcellus gets you about 350 kilowatt hours of total energy from that capital expenditure over the life of the rig, 30 years. The same $1 spent on a on a solar or a wind array gets you 50 kilowatt hours. And in this calculation, I have not counted decline curves for wind and solar. And I've assumed that wind turbines will last 30 years. As you know, they're typically decommissioned after 20. So let's assume they'll last 30. You look at this and you ask, well, how could, this is such a huge disparity. What are they saying? Now, this is not, I'm not trying to be tricky here. There's a lot of engineers in the audience. If you look at this, what you see, two things are missing from this calculation. This is the output of a well, not electricity actually delivered to the grid, right? And this is the output of a solar array, not actually useful electricity. I use the word deliberately. Useful electricity delivered to grid. So in both cases, you have to spend money on something to turn the native energy into something useful for society. Useful for society is delivered when I need it. Delivered in the form I need and when I need it. So the form I need includes when I need it. So the form I need is that the gas from a Marcellus rig has to be turned to electricity with a generator that consumes energy and costs money. So this curve, that bar comes down, right, by about a half because you have capex for the generator and energy consumed and wasted by the generator. But these other two bars go down too because I have to buy batteries. I'm assuming, for the sake of argument, that I want to have this 100% vision of replacing all hydrocarbons with wind and solar. To make the electricity useful, by definition, everyone knows you have to store it, which means you're buying some kind of hardware. So to have these ratios stay the same, in other words, not to disadvantage wind and solar, I'd have to assume that batteries and generators cost the same to make these co-equal. Well, they don't. Batteries are a lot more expensive than generating systems. But even if they're the same, this profound disparity tells you something that's very important that's already going on. It's one of these adages, the evidence is hidden in plain sight. What this tells you is, if you want lots of wind and solar, you have to have two grids. You can't store it, which we'll talk about. You have to have two grids. You have to have backup power, by definition, which is the kind of grid we have now that runs whenever you need it, because storing oil and gas is trivially easy. Storing electricity is not trivially easy. It's extraordinarily difficult. So you have two grids. And if you have two grids, you can use a lot of wind and solar. And then the ratio of how much extra non-wind and solar you need and how much backup combustion turbines you need depends on where you live in the world, but you need two grids. You ought to be able to see the two grid effect somewhere in the economics, and you do in Europe. So in Europe, the two grid effect becomes visible in the cost of electricity as you increase the amount of wind and solar used in each country. This is a graph of data from the European Union. This is not made-up data. It's easy to find. College kids can find this. Interns can find it. You could find it if you really want to go diving deep into the data. This is the electric rates in each country mapped against the per capita use of wind plus solar in each country. So on your x-axis is you increase the amount of wind and solar per person. On the y-axis, the cost of electricity is going up. So you have sort of a linear relationship. And you have electricity costing almost 40 cents a kilowatt hour in US terms in Germany and in Sweden. And what is the reason? If there were grid parity, if wind and solar cost the same as the other stuff, why did it go up? This is a simple question. Why? It wouldn't have gone up. It would have been flat. Maybe it would have gone down. But why did it go up? It went up because of what I just said. In the simplistic terms, the system, in order to keep the lights on, in effect, has to have two grids. So you're paying roughly twice as much, but you're actually paying more than twice as much. Because remember, if you have a capital asset, all of you have capital assets, underutilized capital assets cost more per unit of utilization. The reason you're on a power plant 8,000 hours a year is you spread the money out over 8,000 hours of operation. If you run it 2,000 hours a year, it costs the same to build it. You're spreading it out over fewer hours. The costs go up. That's what you're seeing in Europe. This is the path we're following. The question you would have, I don't have this graph, but I'll tell you what the data show. Do we see that in the United States? Right? I mean, US electric rates aren't anywhere like Germany's. So the EIA data shows you that the average retail cost of electricity in America has gone up 20% in the last 15 years. 20%. This is a 200% increase. We had a 20%. So you look at it and say, well, we're okay. Here's the question to think about. In the United States of America, electric rates have gone up 20% in the last 15 years. Why? 70% of our electricity comes from burning gas and coal. Right? 70%. If you know something about utilities and power plants, you know that 70% of the cost of a kilowatt hour from a combustion plant is in the fuel costs. You all know what's happened to the cost of coal because of what gas did to the coal prices. Both costs have collapsed. Are we down 70%? We're down more than 70% in real costs of coal and gas delivered to make electricity in the last 15 years. So do the arithmetic here. You know, 70% of electricity is from coal and gas. Coal and gas prices collapsed from the shale revolution, and electric rates went up. Where'd the money go? I mean, this is an old follow the money adage. Who got the money? Because ratepayers didn't get the money. They got charged more. So where's the spread here? There's a spread between what it could have been, all things equal, versus what actually happened. The could have been versus what actually happened is like $60 to $80 billion a year in electric costs to the American consumer that exist that but for imposing wind and solar on the grid would have been going into consumers' pockets. This is another sort of example where the money went. It went to the manufacturers of large reciprocating engines. This is an EIA graph of the number of gigawatts of big diesel engines. They used to burn diesel fuel. Most of them now are aspirated with natural gas, as you know. When I say big, these are cruise ship-sized engines. They're 10-megawatt engines, 20 megawatt individual engines. This is the number of those engines that have been put on the US grid going back to 1950 through 2018. And you'll notice the graph suddenly pops up big time around the year 2000. Or to use a phrase that the president uses, big league. There's a big league jump there. People thought he said bigly, but he was saying big league with, you know, a Queen's accent. So what happened around 2000? A lot of wind turbines started to get added to the American grid. If you have wind added to the network, this is not complicated. Wind turbines make real cheap electricity when they're running. When the wind sags, and it sags quickly, it doesn't sag predictably by hours. It's predictable in the sense there's more wind at night than there's in the daytime. But wind lulls happen fairly quickly, and you don't want the system to go dark. If you can't borrow power from your neighbor, you have to turn on a generator in minutes. The only generators you can turn on in minutes are reciprocating engines, big car engines. So we have added 300% more reciprocating engines to the US grid in the last decade than in the previous half century. They cost money. The wind turbine guys aren't paying for this. Ratepayers are. None of this says there won't be more wind and solar in the future. So I'm going to beat up on wind and solar some more and Teslas in a minute. But I admire Elon Musk. We'll get to him. And I think Teslas are great cars. What a great story stock. I wish I was a story stock player. I wish I'd bought Tesla at $100 a share and sold it in January. Who wouldn't, right? That's 100 to 8,000. I mean, it is a 10-banger. Look, there will be more wind and solar in the future for two reasons. First, they're much better than they have ever been in history. Wind and solar generation technology are cheaper now by a factor of 10 than they've ever been in history. That's a big deal. There's a lot more places more wind and solar can be used economically all over the world, without any question. There's also no question that world governments, for at least the next 5 years, I don't know whether past 5, are not going to get exhausted with providing subsidies for this stuff. So we're subsidizing it globally. The only question on the table is, when do peak subsidies happen? Because they will happen. And what's the cost curve look like for wind and solar? They're cheap now. How much cheaper do they get? This graph is sort of a macro illustration for you. I've overlaid the share of world's electricity that came from nuclear power, as you can see, starting in 1970 through 1990, a 20-year period, with the share of world's electricity that comes from wind and solar starting from 2009. Different time periods, but obviously these two technologies began their additions to world energy at different time periods. But the two curves are unbelievably similar in their growth rate. I think they're similar in the growth rate for a very similar reason. These are both sort of fuel-free technologies. The cost of fuel for a nuke is sort of largely irrelevant. They're very capital-intensive technologies. They both require subsidies. Nuclear power plants are heavily subsidized, as Jim has ably demonstrated in his writings. And they cost a lot of capital. Wind and solar are the same way. At some point, markets can only absorb so much capital-intensive generation and subsidized generation, and there's a capitulation globally. The nuclear capitulation happened long before Fukushima, Chernobyl effects. This is a capital capitulation. So the question you'd have is, do wind and solar follow the nuclear curve, or do they go a little further? I don't know if they go. I think they might go a little further. This is just my personal guess. But they're going to look. It's going to look something like this as a share of world electricity for the same reasons: capital capitulation, and because the technologies are not getting cheap fast. So nuclear got cheap fast. From 1950 to 1970, the cost of a reactor really collapsed, and then it stopped getting cheaper. It actually started getting more expensive for other reasons. But if this were to happen, if my sort of macro guess is right, and you're an investor in wind and solar, you're feeling very good about this. So if you're a Green New Dealer, you're not feeling good about this. If you think the transition's coming and it's important to happen, this makes you unhappy. Because what that means is that the share of world energy coming from wind and solar peaks at 5%, maybe 6%, single digits of world energy, not electricity, just like nuclear did. That doesn't change the world. But if you're an investor, this is a percentage of an expanding pie. To double the percentage of electricity supplied to the world from wind and solar over the next decade or two, means more than a tripling in the physical infrastructure of wind and solar. This is a very bullish place to put capital to work, which is why you're seeing capital go there. So even if you're call it a pessimist about a transition, the reality of what's going to happen is very bullish, big tailwinds for more wind and solar, which is not a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with more wind and solar, especially in countries like India, in southern India, and southern China, in southern United States. There's a lot of places where solar is more economical, and in windy places, particularly offshore, if you're happy with offshore turbines, or windy Midwest, there's viability. But this is not a transition. This is an additional option. It's the old adage, is another arrow in the quiver. It's an additional way to provide critical energy to society. It's not a massive transition. The reason it's not a transition is locked up into, and I'm going to redound to physics again, but to put it in economic terms, it's locked into the laws of diminishing returns in all machinery. There are asymptotes. You remember what an asymptote is in your high school math. It's a curve that looks like this. It gets closer to the axis but never gets there. Things get better quickly after you invent them, and they get better more slowly after you've made them good, because we figure out how to manufacture an item. We figure out what the laws of physics are pertaining to that item, and engineers inevitably rapidly chase cost curves down until they can't beat Mother Nature. So on your right, these are the asymptotic curves for the improvements in combustion engines, gas turbines, internal combustion engines, and the steam engine. I put horse here, too, because we measure things in horsepower, and also because horses haven't got any better. If I had a curve for 1 billion years, maybe, I don't know when 500 million years, we'd probably see an asymptote for horses, because, Mother Nature took a lot longer to get on the asymptote, and now it's flat. Horses don't change their biomechanical, biophysical energy efficiency. The interesting thing is that horses were as good as steam engines, if you probably noticed this in energy terms early on. It took a while for steam engines to get better than horses. But that asymptote is just locked into the physics. You can't get more energy out of oil than exists in the oil. So all you want to know is, what's the maximum amount of energy in a barrel of oil? And when I know that, then I can ask a physics question, what's the maximum amount of that energy that can be converted in theory into rotational energy? We know those numbers are locked into the laws of thermodynamics. And that's why you get asymptotes. You can get close to it, and you get a little bit better each year. You could ask the same questions about wind turbines and solar arrays. They follow the same kinds of laws. The solar arrays early on were not very efficient. They converted about 5 or 6% of photons into electrons. Now they convert 26%. This is a lot better. So the combination of that 5-fold gain in conversion efficiency with manufacturing efficiencies, you get this 10-fold collapse in prices. The question is, how much better can they get? We know the answer. It's not a subsidy question. It's not a political question. It's called the Shockley limit. It's a physics limit of how many photons could become electrons. The number is 33%, just so you know. So if the best solar arrays ship at 26% conversion efficiency today, you can't make them 10 times better. You can get in the 30s. That's it. You're done. You can't have 10x. You can't throw subsidies at it and say it'll get better. You can't wish it'll get better. That's it. That's the finish. Same with wind turbines. There's a limit to that as well. It's the same thing as saying, look, propeller airplanes were first invented. They kept going faster and faster. And then at some point, they couldn't go any faster. They couldn't break the speed of sound because propellers pull air, and they push air. Air and sound are the same thing. That's what sound is, as you know. And they stop going faster. They hit a physics wall. You have to change your technology, and that's why you make jet engines. Jet engines are different technology. So you could make the same analogy for combustion turbines. If I don't like the particular kind of combustion turbine I have, could I invent a different kind? The answer is yes. But even there, you can't get more energy out of the material than exists in the material. This is true for batteries. It's true for wind turbines. It's true for solar arrays. Those are the asymptotes. We are now on the asymptote for all of the so-called green technologies. This curve you see is a simplified version of the National Renewable Energy Labs curve in history and going forward. They're not naive about this. What they're saying is we're going to get better by a few percent a year. That's not nothing. Aviation turbine vendors fight fiercely for a 2 or 3% gain a year. But what it does, not do is create a, quote, revolution. So this is the battery reality, and I'm going to switch from grids to batteries for a very simple reason. Maybe the most infectious idea about the magic way to get rid of hydrocarbons, and oil in particular, is the Tesla, Elon Musk. He has accomplished something that no one else has accomplished, arguably in the world since World War II, certainly the United States for 80 years. He's built a car company that actually sells cars at large volumes, a new one. No one's done that. When you think about it, Bricklin tried it, DeLorean tried it, people have tried it, the famous Tucker brothers tried it. No one's managed to do it. He's done it. Set aside whether he's making a profit or not. This is a detail that kind of matters eventually. But well, if he survives long enough on subsidies and the story stock, he could turn a profit. It's possible. Depends on how many people want to buy expensive cars. But he's done a remarkable thing. So we now have electric cars that are practical. Practical at the high end of the market, but practical. They work, which is not nothing. It's an amazing accomplishment. I mean, if you think about this, the electric car was made possible roughly contemporaneously when the smartphone was made possible. And they were both made possible by the same energy technology, which is the lithium battery. Lithium batteries changed the world. And that's what the Nobel Committee said last year when they gave the Nobel Prize in Chemistry to the 3 scientists who invented the lithium battery. You do know Whittam, the scientist, one of the 3 scientists, you know he discovered the mechanism to make lithiated battery chemistry in the mid-70s. You know where he worked. Exxon's R&D labs. There's a certain irony to that, I think. It's kind of delicious, really. But think of the timeline. Mid-1970s, the first commercial battery at a price that small things would pay was in the mid-80s. And by 2005, 2007, so you could do your math here, right? You're 40 years later, you now enable the possibility of an electric car. And that's because you can go 4 times further per fill-up in a Tesla than you could in any previous electric vehicle. The measure that matters when you have a product like that is how far do I go between fill-ups. Set aside price, that's what matters. So 4x gain is what tipped the market. That's a big deal. Electric vehicles went from 0, essentially, to 4 million electric vehicles from 2007 today. Pretty impressive. Electric vehicles today have 0.4% of global transportation markets. Let me just give you a comparison to another battery-enabled technology, which is relevant to this discussion because people always analogize the tech world to the energy world. The smartphone, which was also finally made possible roughly at the same time with the first iPhone. We went from 0 smartphones, essentially, to 3 billion in the same time period, 3 billion, which now have 60% of global market share for personal communication devices. The velocity of that market adoption in a telecommunications area is feasible because you're dealing with bits, not atoms. The velocity of adoption in the atoms world, physical stuff, has always been much slower, always will be much slower because of the physical inertia. These are big systems. The question everybody always asks is, well, your batteries will get better. But what if they get better? Invariably, that's a fair question to ask. This graph answers that question. If you reduce it to the metric that matters, not watt hours per kilogram and, not physics terms, miles per pound of fuel in your car. That's what matters. If you build a car, you care how much, if you build an airplane, if you build a rocket ship, the metric that matters is how much of your payload is fuel, and as opposed to stuff that you're trying to move, like goods and people. Ideally, what you want is the fuel to weigh nothing and to have the whole payload be stuff that you are paying to move. So this shows you the miles per pound of fuel for an internal combustion engine going back to 1990 in green, and for an electric car. The electric car's miles per pound of fuel doubled in 2007. You can't see the doubling at this scale because of the scale, right? And the little dots, the circle, the green circle and the red circle, those are the maximum theoretical distance you can get per pound of fuel for a battery-powered vehicle in an internal combustion engine. So the red is the theoretical energy density of the best lithiated chemistry, using 100% of its energy capability. That gets you the red circle on the far right, miles per pound of fuel. The green circle is not the theoretical energy density for miles per pound of fuel with hydrocarbons, with gasoline. That's an actual engine that exists. They're called racing car engines. That's what we can build if you want to pay that much for a domestic car, which would be another way of saying if you want to pay on average the price for a Tesla. Most people who buy cars at over $100,000 are not buying performance. They don't want a racing car. It goes fast, yeah, I'll stipulate. But you can buy cars for a third the price that go as fast as a Maserati. They're buying something else. You know that 80% of all the electric vehicles sold in America last year were Teslas. 80%. If we take China out of the equation because it distorts the market, 50% of all the EVs sold in the world last year were Teslas. Amazing accomplishment. Put differently, if you're a marketer, you would say this: people don't want to buy an electric car. People want to buy a Tesla because there are dozens of other electric cars available, but he's utterly crushing the market. And I say good for him. I mean, it's really a heck of an accomplishment. But if you're looking from the engineering economics perspective and asking where's the world going as batteries get better, this is where the world goes. And then the separate question is, well, what if the batteries get cheaper? And we get 400 million electric cars in the world in the next 2 decades instead of 4 million that we have today. Because that's the forecast that the optimists are making. Maybe there'll be 400 million. I'm skeptical, but it's possible. It's not impossible. But you could do the math on this. Again, this does not require an elliptical forecast from an economist. It's just arithmetic. If you look at the number of cars in the world today and the number that will be around in 20 years, and look at 400 million EVs, and look where oil is used, what the arithmetic yields is 400 million EVs eliminates 9% of world oil demand in the year 2040. 9%. Is that a lot? Yeah. You're all in the oil and gas business. If I make a forward forecast that changes the amount of oil demand by 1% for the world, 1 million barrels per day, prices whipsaw as soon as you move 1 million barrels per day of getting it wrong. So 10 million barrels per day is not nothing of world oil demand. It's a powerful downward pressure on prices over time as EVs expand. No question about that. Moving millions of barrels per day out of oil into lithiated chemistry has meaning. Is it a transition? No. Is it an interesting option? Sure. And the data show it. What the data also tell you is that this will be very bullish for the mining industry. Right? I mean, you know how big a battery is in a Tesla, I assume. It weighs 1,000 pounds. This is no knock on Elon Musk. It's what an 80 kilowatt-hour battery pack weighs in any car, 1,000 pounds. You know what your gasoline tank weighs when you fill it up with the same range of gasoline, I assume, right? About 140 pounds. So to get the same range, I have 1,000 pounds. Now, if you're an environmentalist, what you want to do is you want to look at the fuel cycle because, as I told you at the outset, there's no difference in energy sources from the fundamental physics perspective. The energy's free. We have to dig stuff out of the earth to build things to make the energy useful. So we're digging different stuff out of the earth if you're going the battery route. Let's ignore the fact that the diggers, the Cat D9s, are oil-fired. That's detail. What's interesting is how much stuff do you dig out of the earth. For a 1,000-pound battery, you have to dig out of the earth, process, and move something like 500,000 pounds of stuff per battery. You know, this is nickel, cobalt, manganese, steel, minerals. You have to dig it up, and you have to process it, and you have to move it. And it gets moved in trucks, and it gets, if the trucks are battery-powered, well, hey, whatever. It's a do loop. You're still digging more stuff out of it. You're digging a lot. It's a lot of stuff. On a per unit of energy service delivered basis, going the wind-solar battery route increases the physical extraction of materials from the earth 3 to 10-fold. But it increases 3 to 10-fold somewhere else. By that I mean in mines in Russia, mines in China, mines in Congo. As you probably all know, infamously, something like half of the world's cobalt is mined in Congo. The UN thinks half of that's mined with child labor by hand because the ore grades are rich and near the surface, so they can literally dig it up by hand with children. We have cobalt in America. We just choose not to be miners in America. We made that decision some years ago to not expand the mining industry. But I say we made the decision. We made it behaviorally by virtue of how our governments operate and make it very difficult to open up new mines in America. So the path to go lots more wind and solar is not some magic unobtainium path where the battery is this sort of magical, weightless goo that just produces energy. It's like everything else. It's a material. You have to dig it up and process it. It takes chemicals to process. It takes energy to process. As a calibration point for you, you probably know two things, maybe not. 60% of the world's batteries are made in Asia currently, under current plans that everybody believes will happen, even counting the Lordstown plant. 70% of the world's batteries will be made in Asia in the next decade. Making a battery requires a battery that holds the energy equal to a barrel of oil equivalent requires 100 barrels of oil equivalent of energy to manufacture it. If that battery is manufactured in a coal-heavy grid, which it will be, then you have a carbon dioxide, we'll call it debt, associated with making the battery. That car repays the debt by not burning a hydrocarbon. It's true. But where that car operates will determine whether it ever repays a debt. If that car operates in Sweden, it repays the debt in about 3 years. If it operates in the United States on average, it never repays a debt. If it operates in Asia, it never repays a debt because their grid is 60% coal-fired. These aren't political points. These are not aspersions against batteries. I ran a battery factory for a while. I like batteries. I think they're fascinating. Batteries will get better. They'll get twice as good. But even as you saw, getting twice as good doesn't mean that batteries are better than oil. The inherent energy density of hydrocarbons is 5,000% higher than the inherent energy density of lithiated chemistry. So if you're an engineer and you're trying to make something that doesn't require a lot of weight, you pick hydrocarbons. If you're trying to make something that appeals to people for other reasons, which is what marketing is all about, you pick lithiated chemistry. So here's what people pick when they buy a car. This is the IEA data for the percentage of vehicles that people buy each year that are SUVs. Not EVs, but SUVs. And yes, I know there are some electric SUVs, but they fall in that big bucket I told you. This is the percentage of vehicles that are. So last year, you may know this, more than half of all cars bought in America were SUVs or light trucks. They're the same category. The interesting thing about this curve, it shows you South Africa, Europe, China, and the United States and India. If you look at the world graph, which is the middle one, the world went from roughly 14% of all cars, 15% were SUVs in 2010, to the world market is 30% SUVs. Europe this is where the rising millennial generation is very green and woke. We know that. So look at Europe. Right, Europe's just behind the United States, with approaching half of all new vehicle purchases are SUVs. What's going on? I mean, this has happened during that decade, which everybody has called, this is the decade of climate awareness, this last decade. During the decade of climate awareness, when everybody has been told and bludgeoned that driving SUVs is causing a climate problem, this is the behavioral response. If you were an analyst, you'd look at this and say, well, if you wanted this to stop, you'd say, this is not so good. You can stop this. You can actually ban SUVs. You can tax them out of existence. There's lots of things governments can do. But this is what's been going on globally, even where there are incentives not to use them, even where there are incentives to use other things like small electric vehicles. That's the reality of what the market's doing. What people think is going to happen, and this is my last piece of physics for you, but I have to show you this. What people think is going to happen is that tech's going to change everything and to save the day. We're on the cusp, just like the smartphone changed everything. And you've probably all been to a presentation where somebody says what the energy future is going to be like, and they pull out their smartphone and wave it around and say, look how much this changed. This is what technology does in the 21st century. This is really a big deal, and they're right. This one smartphone, you all have one. Years ago, I used to ask people in an audience how many people have one of these in their pocket or purse, and you could only get half the people in the room to raise their hand. This would be like 2009. if you go to a retirement home, if you go to an elementary school and ask the question, everybody got one. Because this computer has 10,000 times more compute horsepower than an IBM mainframe that filled this room in 1980. 10,000 times more. And it uses, this by itself sips a nightlight's worth of electricity. And the energy efficiency gains in this are a billionfold. Billionfold energy gains happen in logic. They happen in communication systems. They never happen, they can't happen in the universe of energy. This is a graph that tells you how they scale in the opposite direction. This is a simplification of real data of computers and engines scaled by power and size. So your x-axis is getting bigger to your right. The y-axis is more powerful going up. And this is, and again, I know it's lunch and it's afternoon. This is a log-log curve. Sorry. That means that every increment's a 10x. So you go from this corner to that end, it's a millionfold increase in size and a millionfold increase in power. So the gray line is what happens to the size of an engine as its power gets bigger. When you go from a size engine to an aircraft engine, it's a million times bigger and it's almost a million times more powerful. The red line is the size relationship for computers. As we've gone to a million times more powerful, we've gone to a billion times smaller. This is why I put the picture of Tony Stark up here from Iron Man, for those of you who have kids of a certain age and watch these things and don't want to confess that you actually watch them too. You know the magic unobtainium power pack is put in his chest that allows him to fly around like a jet engine, right? That's the unobtainium. You know how long you can actually fly a human, 100-kilogram human being with the most energy-dense fuel that exists, oil? You've seen the pictures of the guy with his jet-powered backpack, right? He's carrying something on the order of 40 kilograms, big bladders full of kerosene, and he flies for 3 minutes. It's not so easy to fly, weight around. What this tells you is why the electric cars will take over the world, electric airplanes. Electric airplanes are practical, of course they are. It's a question of how much stuff you want to fly, how far. We'll never have a battery-powered airplane flying you to Asia, if you want to go back to Asia again ever. It'll never happen. How do I know? How can I say never? You're a physicist. I can say never because if the physics existed, it would fly Tony Stark around. This is comic book stuff. We know how many batteries it would take to fly an A380 or 777. We know. We know how much fuel's in a 777. To give you a calibration point again, the quantity of Tesla batteries, which are among the best commercial batteries in the world, he makes a good battery, to have as much energy as used in an A380 or a 777 to fly to Asia. The quantity of batteries weighs 3 times more than the entire airplane. So I'll make the batteries 3 times as good. Great. So the airplane can fly itself, but no people. I mean, and you can't make it 3 times as good. I showed you the lithiated chemistry limit. It's about 2x. 2x is not nothing. It'll make drones more reasonable. It'll actually make something else practical, which I'll get to and wrap with. So the reason I'm beating up on this is because serious people are saying silly things about energy. They're saying that the smartphone substitution that I have, no one believed that smartphones and cell phones would replace landlines. That's the transition that we're on the cusp of. This is the International Monetary Fund, for goodness sake, saying just silly stuff. No, it's not an analogy that has any meaning. It's a silly analogy. It's a comic book analogy. There's no similarity between these two magisteria of physics. They scale differently. But they're related in energy terms in this sense. So I want to wrap out with sort of a forward look for you. This is the Federal Reserve data on capital spending in the United States economy by businesses. And what they track, right? They track industrial equipment, transportation equipment, structures, you know what structures are, and information equipment. I've conjoined the 2 curves they track, which is enterprise software and information equipment itself. They're about co-equal. The reason I did that is because enterprise software doesn't exist unless it's in equipment. Cyberspace is not virtual. It's data centers. If you put the 2 together, you find that the United States has been spending more money on bit-related hardware, enterprise stuff that it hasn't anything else in the economy since the turn of the century. So people who talk about that we're on the cusp of something big with digital technologies are right. This is meaningful. It's meaningful all kinds of ways. It's meaningful for our economy. It's meaningful for the democratization of software, finally. Software really, to use a technical term, most software sucks. Right? Think about it. When you update your phone, give me a break. It should be this hard. If you try to use any kind of new software, the magic of any really good software is when it's really easy to use. The reason cars got democratized is they got easy to use. We're on the cusp of software getting easy to use. You can talk to it. Everybody's a little scared of computers you can talk to, but most people are already talking to their computers, right? Whether they're in the cloud or in your handheld. We're on the cusp of making software easy. Once you put this much money into something that's really valuable, that's easy to use, you do get revolutions. But they're not revolutions in how we make energy. Actually, it's sort of a revolution in how we use energy. All this stuff uses electricity. I put the data point up for you. A lot of this stuff is driven from the cloud, most of it. Cloud data centers are called warehouse-scale computers. They're buildings the size of a Walmart or a Costco, or wherever you like to go. They don't have any human beings in it. Looks like the Borg ship from Star Trek. Blinking lights and computers. And these are warehouse-scale buildings full of electricity-consuming heaters, central processing units. They consume 50 megawatts a pop. We have thousands of them in the world. We're building thousands more. Every time one gets built, $1 billion worth of data centers gets constructed. It's 2 billion kilowatt hours of electricity over the life of the servers in that data center. And we're building $400 billion worth of those a year. This is consuming something. It's consuming energy. Is it an existential threat to the energy demand? Is it moving the meter in the world? I think, sure, not existential, but it is. Global cloud now uses more electricity than the country of Japan. It's meaningful. The country of Japan is just one country, so as a percentage of the world's electricity, 7%, 5%. It's a lot. It's actually bigger than the chemical industry now, by the way. So processing data consumes more electricity and energy than processing chemicals. And we know which one's growing faster. But the more interesting thing about the data world is its spillover effect. The spillover effect that matters the most is in propelling our economy and driving productivity. I mean, ultimately, we will see productivity gains from this. We aren't really seeing them yet. When I say that, we know that we aren't, because the productivity growth in the U.S. economy has been sagging and lagging for 2 decades. So we're still waiting for the productivity benefits from these things to really be systemic. I think it's coming. That's what my next book's about. But it already has a measurable spillover effect. I could ask the same question in this room that if I'd asked this 5 years ago, the percentage would have been lower. How many people shop and go click to buy something? Click. What happens when you go click? You light up computer servers all over the world, and you light up airplane engines, and you light up ship engines, and you light up truck engines. And you'll light up construction for warehouses, because this whole thing is driven by a tripling in warehouse square footage construction rate in the last decade. In order to make this distribution economically efficient, it's not energetically efficient. It uses more energy to deliver a 1 kilogram book to your house from an Amazon truck than driving to the mall. There's no way you can calculate that that saved any energy. But it saved the most precious commodity in the universe, your time. Now, you happily pay for that. So what you see is warehouse employment and transportation employment going up, warehouse construction going up. The only thing that's caused this to happen is not population growth. This is way faster than population growth, way faster than GDP growth. This is one-click shopping. So let me end on two graphs for you. One of them, they're both bullish for oil and gas. So you're in the oil and gas business. Unless I sound like a Pollyanna that you can't get hurt by low prices or by bad policies, can I just stipulate? Both can destroy companies and businesses and countries. So bad policies and low prices, punitive taxes, punitive regulations can destroy businesses in the oil and gas business. They have in the past. They will again. That worries me. But I'm talking about what the macro realities are in energy economics and the economy, where the world wants to go and where it's been going. So the stipulation is I'm bullish on oil and gas long term, not because I'm naive about what Congress and states can do, but because I know what reality tells us is going to happen ultimately. The transition to what the future will be from where we are can be rocky. Here's an interesting transition question for you. Global demand for oil and gas. Global matters for you in Ohio. You all know why. We can't possibly consume in America the quantity of oil and gas that America is already producing and was going to produce, especially gas. There's no possible demand vector where we can consume what we can produce. So world demand actually matters a lot to us. It also matters to how prices are set. So what you'd want to know is the over-under. What's the demand for oil and gas, and therefore what's the price of oil and gas going forward? This is one of the most revealing curves I've seen in recent times. The IEA published 3 weeks ago what they, I forget what they call it, Sustainable Development Scenario for Oil and Gas Industry. They wanted to look at the role of the oil and gas industry and what they're calling sustainable development, which is a euphemism for dealing with climate change, for reducing how much oil and gas we use. And there's a set of forecasts, but this is the one that matters. The Sustainable Development Scenario is the Paris scenario, the one I started with, that everybody does what they pledged for non-hydrocarbons. Now, IEA has said everybody's not doing what they pledged, because we know they're not. But they have a scenario called the SDS, Scenario Development Scenario. If everybody does what they pledged, what impact does that have for global demand for oil and gas? I mean, if you're gas and oil producer, you'd want to know. That's what this graph shows you. The top one is the demand for oil peaking very quickly and starting to bend down, and demand for natural gas peaking, right around 2022 and starting to bend down. So if everybody does what they promised in the Paris Accord, what the IEA is saying, global demand for oil and gas will peak and slowly trend down. Two things are important about this. You know what I think about whether that actually happens. I'll take the bet. Anybody here, 2 to 1 bet, over, under, I'm happy to take this bet. This doesn't happen. But if you believe it's going to happen, and it might happen because governments push subsidies to make it happen, what IEA is showing is the supply curve for oil and gas, which is the lines, you see the dotted line and the orange line? These are the supply curves for oil and gas. The IEA is saying unequivocally, in clear English, that the current investments in oil and gas globally cannot supply world demand for oil and gas starting around 2022, 2023. Next to a couple of years from now. They're not saying this in an alarmist way. They're just saying there's a problem here. We're not going to have enough supply to meet demand if the climate Paris scenario works. Never mind if we actually get more growth than climate scenario proposes. Well, if you're a commodities trader, you're just waiting for the 6-month signal that the tip has happened, right? The supply-demand curves have crossed. Then you know what happens to prices. Prices go crazy again. They go up. So the big wild card for your business and for equity investors and others is whether or not the E&P companies in this room and those in other basins think it's Mardi Gras time again, or they have disciplined response to high prices. I don't mean this to be unkind. I don't think there's going to be any disciplined response. This would be a fun bet. Let's just say we took a pool and asked, what is the price for oil or gas? You pick I think oil is a better one to pick because it's still more tightly globally denominated. Gas is sort of dragged around by it. Oil at what price has everybody think it's Mardi Gras? And they're just drill, baby, drill. I just, stimulate, frack the ducks, which is, you all know what that means. Nobody else knows what that means outside this room. Just bring those guys on. Get that sand here. Boom. And what you can do just depends on how many trucks there are and how many frack crews there are. We're talking weeks and months, not years, to turn on, I don't know, 1 million, 2 million barrels per day of supply, whatever you think the duck overhang is. It's some number more than 1 million, less than 3 million barrels per day. It's a big number. It's kind of like a country's worth of oil gets turned on overnight. And if oil's at $60 a barrel, 70, if it's 80, I think it's 80, it's Katie bar the door. People are just drunk with happiness and just stimulating and drilling, right? And what does that do to prices? I mean, you guys, this is like an old movie for oil and gas. I just think what will happen this time is we're going to see the first global experiment in all of history that, well, for 100 years. We haven't had an experiment with the new velocity of oil and gas production. We've had about 100 years of oil and gas production velocity based on how the world is operated. Now we have sort of 10 or 15% of the world operating at high velocity, world oil supply, which is the shale fields. We'll see what that does to supply and price. I think it's going to, we'll get Mardi Gras, supply will go fast, price will sag fast. I think we get more volatility. I think we have shorter cycles and more range bound. That's my personal guess. So we don't get the $140 a barrel because you all know this. You don't need $140 to get drunk on profits from stimulating a well. At 80, it's just like you've made your money back in like 30 days. You've got 400% IRR in like 7 months. What's not to love? You're just drilling like mad until the party's over, and then you just wait again. And the guys that go bankrupt, the 30% that went bankrupt last time, go bankrupt again because they got out of their skis to, it's like the kids' game with the musical chairs. This is what will happen. And that'll happen because oil demand is going to keep creeping up. It doesn't have to go up a lot because supply is dipping down. And the world can't do, as the coronavirus has proven, we know 99% of world transportation is oil-fired. It just is. Right? And it's going to be oil-fired at the 98% level 10 years from now, even if Elon Musk is worth $100 billion. So let me end with one last bullish view of long-term energy. My short-term view you can get. Oil demand is not going away in the short term. The inertia is too big. Supply is already shrinking. This is a problem. And it has unintended side effects, by the way. High prices do cause all kinds of bad behavior and odd behaviors, and markets misbehave. But longer term, are there no new demands for oil and gas? We've finished, in effect, inventing everything that will consume energy. There was no demand for oil for aviation before we invented airplanes. I mean, pre-1930, there was no oil demand for airplanes. Pre-1910, there was no oil demand for cars. Pre-1950 and change, there was no energy demand for computing. You get the point, right? I mean, what engineers do is they invent demand for products, which invariably invents demand for energy, because everything consumes energy. So if you're going to just do the thought experiment, what two things are in the process of being invented that aren't commercially useful? What are their implications for energy demand? There's a lot of things that fit in that category. One I don't have up here. If I was going to do a trifecta, normally I like to do things in threes, because three is the Aristotelian, trinity, the three numbers, stories have beginning, middle, and end. I mean, three is great. But my third is robots, right? Robots eat too. Okay? Just think about are robots practical? Of course they are. But are robots that are really useful practical? Not yet. A really useful robot would be a robot that can walk around a construction site for safety reasons and keep track of stuff and look for hazards, report them quickly. I mean, that's what Boston Dynamics is now leasing in their Spot Mini. If you haven't seen Spot Mini, go to the magic Google machine, type in Boston Dynamics Spot Mini. Great, slick PR, but not crazy. It's not crazy any longer to think about untethered, quasi-anthropomorphic robots doing useful things. Would you want a robot in your house? Well, if you ask somebody in 1890, when most people didn't have a horse and a buggy, more people own cars by a factor of 10 than own horses, because cars are cheaper than horses by a lot, even today, I think. But they were then. No one could have imagined a world where everybody had a car. But can you imagine a world where every household would have a Spot Mini? And why would you have it? Well, one of the things that they've thought about is for elderly and infirm people. If you want to open doors, carry packages, assist somebody walking upstairs so they don't have to live in assisted living, inexpensive anthropomorphic robots do those things. And they do them pretty effectively, almost effectively enough to be commercially viable. Too expensive today. But those things really are on a cost declining curve, because those things are in fact built largely from the things that are on a fast declining curve, which are smart brains, robot brains, the AI control systems. You could do a thought experiment on how much energy will be involved in making, pick your number, 100 million, as many robots a year as you make cars. Takes energy to make them, takes energy to operate them. But robots seem sort of like Isaac Asimov crazy science fiction. So it's in my book on Work in the Age of Robots. I think robots we don't have to guess they're coming. They're already here. If you haven't seen the new video from Boston Dynamics on their warehouse robot, and the reason they built a warehouse robot, you understand, is they're having trouble hiring enough people for warehouses. It's your fault for one click. There literally aren't enough human beings to be hired in warehouses. So you need robots to assist the people in warehouses. And the magic in a warehouse robot isn't you've seen the ones that look like turtles that carry pallets around on marked tracks. That's easy. That wasn't the magic. The magic is how do you get a box off a shelf and put it on the pallet? It's the pick. And everybody's been trying to figure out how to make a robot to pick a box off a shelf. The new Boston Dynamics robot that does that is pretty amazing. It doesn't look like a person. It's got 2 wheels and suction cups, and it picks boxes off shelves and puts them on the pallet. It doesn't eliminate all the human beings in the warehouse. It fills in where they can't get humans. This trend is already underway. This is a revolution that's happening in plain sight, but it still sounds like science fiction. So I'm going to go to the one everybody thinks is easy, which is self-driving cars. Much harder, by the way. A robo-car is really hard. People who think robo-cars are coming tomorrow are just wrong. It's a very, very difficult piece of engineering. But they'll eventually come. We'll eventually make robo-cars better. The real question is, would robo-cars increase or decrease energy use if you're an energy analyst? They'll be more efficient than, because you're a lousy driver, and a robot will be a better driver, and it'll be more energy efficient, especially as you tell it to be energy efficient. It won't reduce energy use. It'll increase how much road miles people use. We know that. We know these analyses have been done by economists. I don't trust economists because they never do forecasts properly, but whatever. They can't hindcast accurately. Never mind forecast. But we'll accept that this is an economics question. If you reduce the cost of something, people buy more of it. And if something's valuable, people buy more of it. Well, what's valuable? Personal mobility. We've known that for a century. Who can't engage in personal mobility easily? Those who are too young to drive or too infirm or old to drive. In 20 years, that's 150 million Americans. They'll all be in cars if there's robocars. What else would happen if there's robocars? The distances that are really annoying to fly, and nobody wants to take a train because it's too expensive to build, not to take the subsidized ticket. But the distances that are roughly the 250 to 300 to 400 mile range are very difficult to be cost-effective in time for airplanes. And you all know why we all do those flights. But driving that distance is kind of mildly exhausting. You really don't want to do it. But if your car would take you there as safely as the plane, this is not a complicated thing to figure out. You can do it anecdotally, but modeling it, you find a lot of people would just take their Suburban and sleep in it to go from here to back where I live in D.C. Or work, or ride. The energy efficiency of that is much worse than airplanes are like cattle cars. They're extraordinarily efficient in terms of BTUs per passenger mile. The car is not. But it's much more personally efficient, much more socially efficient. People will do that. So when the EIA calculated this, and the guys at UC Berkeley in the business school did a calculation, they came up with roughly 1 million barrels per day of net increase in oil demand in the United States alone from robocars, which is just that's a California. So we add a California worth of oil demand when robots start driving cars, which will eventually happen. And will the cars be 1 million barrels per day more efficient? Probably not. But what it means is the cost curve doesn't get bad. Will it be driven by battery-powered cars? I don't care. Because if they are, it'll be gas-fired power plants charging the batteries in the car. And that's fine. The last one I'll leave you with is my in between the two areas of science fiction. It's actually the most likely to happen soonest. Is personal air taxis in general, Uber Air. This seems sort of goofy to think that we're going to start seeing like big drones and helicopters flying around cities. Turns out that's the easiest thing to automate. Aviation is much easier to automate than things on the ground and robots walking around us. You don't have to be an engineer to know why. You can just think about the degrees of complexity, the interactions, the speed of reaction required. The materials revolution that's made it possible to make super lightweight airframes is sort of the hidden revolution here. The increase in efficacy with which we can make by personal I mean a 4-person, 2-person, 5-person sized quadcopter, helicopter, drone, whatever you want to call it. It's no longer science fiction. Right? NASA is running a global network now to look at air traffic control systems with the airframe makers. Airframe makers now include not just about 50 startups around the world, but Aston Martin, Boeing, Airbus. Real companies are designing next generation airframes for personal air mobility. It's not complicated to figure out why, right? If congestion is high and you want to go, all of you have probably done the Houston to Hobby or Houston to Bush Airport or the downtown New York to LaGuardia. If you're an Uber Black kind of customer, which Uber's looked at, and you're willing to pay $140, $120 for that hour ride, what would you pay for a 12-minute ride? This is where economists have some use in microeconomics. They're very useful there. People would pay a lot. They certainly pay $200. So you begin to work back from the $200 to what it would cost to build these kind of air taxis. And we're within not decades, but years from this being viable, economically viable. And once it's economically viable, it'll start showing up in markets where you can get the permitting, the regulations matter. The key impediment in this being practical now is not can you build the airframe, not can it be safe, because they use what are called ballistic parachutes. You probably know what that is. Right? If you worried, you have multiple engines now, so you'd have to have all engines fail simultaneously. The parachute is ejected the way it is in fighter aircraft by an explosive charge. The drone lands safely instead of crashing. All these things are now feasible. The hardest thing is noise. You don't want a lot of lawnmowers landing in quiet urban areas. And that turns out that physics problem is solvable with energy. You can do noise cancellation, which consumes energy, because noise is air moving, and reducing air movement and canceling it requires energy. So you make the airframe less efficient, but you make it quieter. So if you go through all the math on this and say, well, what would happen if 10% of road miles became air miles in America? Because in the universe we live in, you're fighting gravity, you increase energy use. I did it in natural gas terms because, well, first we're in a gas basin here, but also because probably it's going to be natural gas, one way or the other, that moves these vehicles, either in fuel cells or in lithium batteries that are charged with natural gas burned to make electricity. It's a big number. It's 10 TCF. That's what 10% of U.S. road miles going into air miles consumes. Will that happen tomorrow? Obviously not. Will it happen at some point? I think so. I think it's pretty much locked into what we humans want, which again is to save the most precious commodity in the universe, our time, by consuming the cheapest commodity in the universe, which is free, which is energy. And you all sort of the epicenter of a remarkable transformation in one of the most important energy sources the world's discovered in centuries, which is oil and gas. So I think you have a bright future. You have a difficult one for the next few years. I didn't talk about politics. I say good luck on all that. And with that, thank you very much.
Please welcome back to the stage Ohio Oil and Gas Association President Matt Hammond.